Next up, we are going to review Agnes Varda's latest film, VARDA by Agnes.
J'ai fait des films très très différents dans ma vie. Et donc, il faut que je vous dise qu'est-ce que c'est qui m'a mené à faire ce travail pendant tant d'années. Revenons un peu en arrière. Quand au début d'un film, c'est parfois la vie qui l'impose.
And Annie, why don't you tell us a little bit about that film?
Right, so it is the latest and the last film by Agnes Varda, and it basically just brings together her whole career. So she sits down in front of different audiences, sometimes also just in front of the camera, and speaks about her career and the films she's made, and speaks a lot about her visual art as well. That's not as well known as the films. And it's all in French, and she's a lovely, plump old lady, like she says herself. And occasionally she brings a guest with her as well, but it's always in slightly interesting setting. It's visual, also not just in a way that it shows clips from the films, but sometimes they're actually either on set or going on a dolly or something like that. It's interesting if you are a Varda fan. It's a must if you're a Varda fan. If you're not too familiar with Varda, it might be a bit odd for you to watch because you don't really know what she's talking about necessarily, but it's a good depiction of her cinematic vision. So it is a joy to watch. It's interesting, but at the same time it is like a self-biopic a bit, so it's not super entertaining, I'd say.
So my familiarity with Agnes Varda's work is not as good as I would like it to be. So I've seen Vagabond, I've seen One Sings the Other Doesn't, and that is, to be honest, that's it. So I've come to this film as somebody who likes what I've seen, but I don't have an extensive viewing history with her. Now, I have to be honest, I wasn't that into this. I mean, it did play a little. So much of it is Agnes Varda at what are obviously Q&A sessions or film talks, and then it's interspersed a little bit with her recreating shots from her films or explaining how they filmed it, right? So there's a segment with Sandrine Bonnaire talking about Vagabond, which I was quite, and she has the capacity to be self-critical in this film. Despite the fact it is her film and it's about her career, she doesn't shy away from being, self-deprecating or even critical about her process. And that conversation is one. They have a conversation about Sandrine Bonnaire getting blisters on her hand and basically how indifferent and quite cold Agnes Varda was about it at the time. And, she criticises herself for that there. They talk about the lack of commercial success that a couple of her films have, and she's quite self-deprecating about it. It's quite interesting in those moments, but in the other bits, particularly the Q&A sessions, I have to be honest, it plays like a 2-hour TED Talk. And there is, in fact, a year before the film came out, there is a TED Talk that Agnes Varda did, which covers some of the same ground. So she has a segment where she talks about not wanting to fake the passage of time, right? Filming every step that one of her characters took across a courtyard and through a passageway and all the rest of it. That is also in the TED Talk. Now, it's a case of if you've not seen every single one of these things and you have an interest in how they've been made, I question how engaging or even useful this film is. And I've seen a few reviews that actually don't say the same thing as Annie just did, where they said, you'll be very into it if you've seen much of her work, and it's a good primer for people who haven't. I have to disagree. I have to disagree with that. I don't think that is an accurate way to portray it. So whilst she is a wonderful filmmaker, and I think, and we'll come back to this, I think there are bits of that it does get across, and I think there are things there which it is good for. I don't think this is... I honestly don't think this is a good introduction to Agnes Varda. Watch one of her actual films, I think, personally.
Well, I disagree with both of you. And I did see this film a bit ago at the Berlinale, and I specifically made sure that I got to Berlin just to see it because I'm a massive Agnes Varda fan. So I, in one way, can't say, oh, I wasn't aware of Agnes Varda's work, or Clive from 5 to 7 is by far one of the films that brought me into wanting to be a filmmaker. But I do think that I was sitting next to a person who didn't know very much of Varda's work, and I think quite enjoyed it and quite saw not only the personality of the filmmaker come through, but sort of was given a full sort of understanding of how her work happened throughout the years. Secondly, I also learned something about it where I hadn't really known about her sort of artistic work and how her art everything that she thinks about kind of is like reflected and is sort of repurposed and recycled, and some of those things, like, we were in class studying the Gleaners, and these things were translated into her later work. And then finally in, Faces, Places, which we showed a couple months ago, you kind of can see these themes going throughout her stuff. So I think the fact that we were given that opportunity to see such a masterful filmmaker talk about that is priceless. And so for me, it was a priceless film that I was actually in tears about, and this was way before, not way before, but a month or so before she passed away. But that being said, I do think it was like a masterclass. It was a little bit of, it wasn't Faces, Places, but what it did also show is that even with a masterclass and a TED Talk, which if it was, programmed in that way, she has this ability to make things effortless and whimsical, and that's what a good director is. Where we were talking about, the Jim Jarmusch sort of little line in there to kind of pull you out of the film. And frankly, Agnes Varda created that, and her films, originally were the ones that the French New Wave were inspired by, that were able to kind of seamlessly edit into what is a film. And I think that is priceless for anyone who wants to study film history, to be able to see that from her voice.
I think one thing it is definitely good for is, I have had a problem recently, and I say this for somebody who doesn't have that history with Agnes Varda, but is a fan of the work I've seen. And one thing I do have an issue is this kind of slight memification of her that's gone on in recent years, I've noticed, because she's a very, certainly, in recent years, I mean, obviously she's not always been elderly, but, she was rather an elderly French woman who liked cats, and she had kind of a two-tone bob and looked quite quirky, and she was very internet memeable, right? And I think something that got lost in that a little bit is how fiercely an intelligent filmmaker she was. So whilst I have a bit of an issue with the staging of this film, and I don't think it's necessarily the most captivating, I think it is good to hear directly from her, and it is interesting. I do think you're going to get a lot more out of it if you watch a lot of her work. So, I mean, there is one section where she talks about how she created a particular tracking shot in Vagabond, which I find fascinating, because when I watched the film, it really stood out to me. And then hearing her talk about it and, why that approach was taken is quite something. And talking about kind of the themes that go into her work, it is interesting. It's more just a case of I'm not really sure how much of it needed to be in this as a documentary film made by her, because in terms of getting across her concerns as a filmmaker and how she was approaching things, or more accurately, how it then came out in the films, her films do the talking. And this, I feel, was maybe just a little bit too ponderous. It doesn't, and this is what I find myself saying, this is not to say it doesn't have value. It does, it really does. In particular, I think the part that I found the most interesting was, as I think both of you said, the stuff around about her other visual artistry, like the art installations that she worked on, things like that. That I found interesting because that's not something I knew about. The rest of it, it was a little bit like an extended masterclass, which is fine. There's a place for that. I just don't think it's as a 2-hour film at a film festival. That's me.
Yeah, I agree what you say about if you want, this is definitely not the first VARDA you should watch, because if this is the first VARDA you watch, you're not going to necessarily like the rest of her stuff. You should watch one of her films first to kind of get into that mindset into watching this film.
Yeah, and I would argue you should probably watch Cleo from 5 to 7. It's one of the most brilliant films I've ever seen. But see, I don't think this film was ever, I mean, it almost immediately went onto French television. So I think there was a bit of this, which was, you know, it was at the Berlinale because it was Agnes Varda, and because she's a legend. And I think if there was a documentary about other legends, they would have been at Cannes or Berlinale as well. And yet I'm glad that they're showing it in cinemas, because, you know, it's well deserved to be. But maybe even some other films that we'll talk about later were much more well deserved to be. But I think that in the end, one of the things that gets to me is that, and I constantly have this battle, and maybe you guys can agree or disagree with me on this, is that a filmmaker goes through so many different processes and makes so many different films. You see Jim Jarmusch, it might not be his opus and his, but it was an okay, good film. And, she just came off of Faces Places and then made this film that sort of was like reflective on her life and how, and how it had an arc and one of the things, and how her collaborative process works, because she just spent, making this great film with JR about collaboration. And I think it really was a nice anecdote to like the other work that she did. And it's fine sometimes. I'd rather see filmmakers make more films, and I make this argument all the time with this, like Paul Thomas Anderson, like I only make 7 films, or like even Tarantino, I'm only going to make 10 films in my life, where the Woody Allens of the world will make 150, and some will be really bad, and some will be better than others. And so I think even Agnes Varda does feel in that sort of experimental kind of filmmaker, where she would try anything when she feels like it. And that's what's fun about her.
It's interesting to hear you talk about your reaction to it at Berlinale, which was before she passed away, right? Yeah, because a lot of people I think have seen this after she passed away, and I'm probably going to get tarred and feathered in the street for saying this. I think some of the people who've seen it after that, I think they're reviewing the filmmaker and her legacy more than this film. And as I say, it's not to say that I think this is a bad film. I just don't think it was the most need to see film. Like it's like I say, if somebody was thinking about seeing this, I would basically say to them, no, don't bother, go and watch an Agnes Varda film you've not seen, right? If I could go back in time and somebody gave me the option of watching this or watching Cleo from 5 to 7, I'd choose Cleo from 5 to 7, because I've come off the back of it thinking I probably should have watched more Agnes Varda films, not actually really thinking that this film itself was up to much. And that's not me saying that it's a bad film, because I enjoy the bits where she inserted herself into it and she kind of took you through her process. It does have its moments. It's just there are long stretches where that's not what is happening. I think if it had been shorter with more of that sort of stuff in it, then I think this individual film I would have got more out of. But it's more a case of I'm more inclined to tell people go and dig through her back catalogue than actually really going into this film. Oh yeah, and don't get me wrong, I think the VARDA by Agnes, if you're going to tell me I need to sit down and watch any filmmaker talk for their 2 hours about their own work, I'm far more inclined to make it Agnes Varda than a Jim Jarmusch or a Quentin Tarantino, because I think she's a more interesting person. I think she's certainly at the time she tackled them as well, she's done more interesting things. So if you tell me I have to sit and listen to any of these people talk for 2 hours in, Q&A sessions, I'll take her.
Yeah, and I think whereby with some other directors they could do a TED Talk, I think Agnes Varda is so ingrained in the history and the building of the cinema. So she's done so much for cinema that her TED Talk needs to be a film, and it needs to be seen in a cinematic setting.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's also because it's a slightly different perspective as well, in the sense, you know, because I mean, she was there with the whole French New Wave thing, but she kind of stands apart from your Godards because of the stuff she was trying to tackle.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean in terms of she's an interesting person to listen to, because what she has tried to tackle and when she did it, like one sings the other doesn't, is basically, as saying the films that I've seen, that's the one that's coming to mind for me. And the stuff that tries to approach and the time it did it at, that is very interesting to me. So those aspects of it, listening to her talk about that, it is interesting. So as I say, if I'm going to listen to anybody do this, I'd prefer it with somebody like Agnes Varda. It's just not, I'm not going to lie, it doesn't grip me as a film in its own right.
Yeah, and as I was saying, I think it just, I mean, she does stand apart from the other French New Wave directors because she inspired the other French New Wave directors. She was before them. Sometimes they call her the godmother or the grandmother of it, but then, you know, she was sort of their contemporaries. So it was just that she was doing it before them. And also being able to kind of see a filmmaker transition, as we said, into these art and still be approachable is something that's also nice. But which, you know, when you pick a TED Talk person, they've got to be somebody who you relate to, and Godard could never do a TED Talk. No. You know, he would never be able to, and some of his work right now is very unapproachable, even if it's still brilliant.
You don't want to throw yourself out a window because it would be so dull, to be perfectly honest, but there you go.
So our